Hey guys, Brent Build Show, talking about moldings again, okay? Trying to pick the difference between good and bad. Now, I rambled on the last one about ornamental molding, so I apologize because I got too caught up in that. I don't want you using those. Today we're going to be talking about how to tell the difference, how to pick good moldings versus bad. Come join me. So, there's two bases for judging a molding, okay? This isn't the Brent school where I just like what I like. There's a reason behind it, and the first basis is that historical basis. Now, one of the first concepts we learned at North Bennett Street was that everything dates itself. I remember taking moldings off a wall and looking at it, and we were judging by the saw marks on the back of the molding. We were looking at the nails, whether they were cut nails or hand wrought nails or wire nails, because wire nails we know are an 1890s and after invention, whereas the cut nails is 1820 up to that point. So you could actually date and date a building based on the nails. Everything dates itself, even fast forwarding up to today. Conversation pits of the 60s and 70s, right? Hand scraped floors today, faux painting, everything dates itself. So you can walk through a house and look at it and go, oh yeah, they did that 20 years ago. Or if it has, avocado refrigerators, you can go, oh yeah, I grew up with those in the 70s. So everything dates itself. The same thing is true with moldings. Now, the basic concept is, and I remember, if you remember, I did that timeline, but moldings basically shrink as we get newer. Now, that is a change in change in perspective of the importance of moldings. For instance, this is a Georgian molding. Now, I know it's a Georgian molding because of the way it's shaped, just like I know this is a Victorian molding because of the way it is shaped. And I know that this is a molding that came from the last 10 or 20 years because of its size, right? Everything dates itself, and I want you to have the ability to walk into a lumber yard and go, oh yeah, that's not going to work on this house because it has this style, it has this narrative. Remember, we talked about the narrative or the story. So you can actually pick out moldings and determine them. So in the Georgian period, right, which is at 1740s to 1740 to 1780 after the Revolution, right? This is Georgian. The influences that were coming apart during that time was Palladio had his influential book, right? There was the English pattern books from that period. All of them were pushing and promoting this kind of style and this kind of detail versus the Federal period, when you begin to see different types of influences and the moldings and the shapes change, right? And so these moldings and these details have a story, and there's a narrative that you can put in there. So remember, the historical basis is this timeline, this ability to look and judge moldings based on their size, their narrative, and their story. So the other basis for determining kind of a good versus bad molding is this whole classical framework. And remember, we talked about the different shapes of moldings and the ones that are flat and how they communicate, and that there's a language. Well, part of that language is this idea called punctuation. I've mentioned it in a number of these classical videos, but I haven't really explained how it works. Essentially, if I've got a room, let's just say I got this big room. Remember, in the classical video, I was saying that the way these rooms are broken out is in fives, that you break the room out into 5 parts, try to hit 5 here, right? Maybe that's close. And one of the ideas is that in punctuation, it's a relationship, typically 1 to 5, maybe a little bit 1 to 6, 1 to 7, but 1 to 5 is pretty typical in the classical system. And this is where your pedestal would go, right? Right here at that first thing, and it punctuates the wall, right? Same thing is true if I put a doorway in here, right? Where I've got a doorway going across. Actually, if that's a tall room, this doorway is going to be much bigger than that, okay? So if I've got a doorway in here, depending on the width of that doorway will also determine the size of your molding, okay? So let's just say it's a 30-inch opening and you've got a 1 to 5 relationship, you've got about a 6-inch casing, right? Well, obviously that's a huge casing for today, right? That most people aren't putting in 6-inch casings. However, it does give you an idea of the proper size necessary to punctuate the opening. And so you end up with these moldings that are running around the outside of this thing that announce and tell you where to go in, okay? Now, the other thing that I'll talk about when we do the chair rail is that if there was a window in here, it's going to be really tight. Let's just say there's a window in here. That window height is oftentimes, the sill height is oftentimes at that punctuation point. So you see that there's these architectural elements that are coming into your room, coming into your wall that are helping you read that space. And so when this room is unified, say there's another window over here, all of a sudden the parts and pieces start to be drawn together. All of a sudden all these parts and pieces start to make sense. So punctuation is a 1 to 5, it shrinks a little bit, let's say a 1 to 6 relationship of the opening to the size of the casing. Now, what that means is that when you have a big molding like this, it properly and in the classical sense punctuates that opening. Contrast that to new moldings where you have maybe 2.5 inches, and how is this molding going to punctuate that opening? Well, it can't, okay? It's not big enough. It's going to read as, you know, diminutive, just too small, right? And so punctuation is this key idea that speaks to you about the size of your moldings and how they need to be larger in order to communicate well. So another concept is just the proportion, right? We've talked about scale and proportion in a room, but it has to do with punctuation, which we just talked about. Essentially, just like, let's just say this 1 to 5 relationship, okay? Just like that, your door casing should have a relationship, proportional relationship as well, in that all the parts and pieces should speak to one another and be proportionally relational, okay? So, not only, let's say we have a door casing here, much like this federal one, right? Little bead on the end, little thing here, and then your back band up there, right? This part is typically a 1 to 5 relationship for the total size, so that this back band, this back piece back here, actually punctuates the casing, right? And I've seen these classical architects where they will talk about their molding and draw it out here so that this door casing has the same proportions as the room, okay? So that all these parts and pieces, and that's why the beauty of the classical system has moldings that communicate. And not only do they communicate, they relate to one another. So that all of these parts and pieces actually have the same language, right? And you walk into a space like that and you go, I don't know why I like it, but I like it. So there's a proportional relationship between all the parts and pieces. Now, I would put that in contrast to a new molding like this, which in my mind doesn't make any sense. Because this shape here, right, is bigger than the base or whatever it's going to think. So if this is a base molding that's going to sit here, this cap or this top piece has a, you know, overwhelming size to it. Now, it's not overwhelming because it's so blah, and we'll talk about that next. So guys, just wrapping up this detail, you know, how do you tell the difference between these moldings, right? How do you pick a good molding versus the bad molding, which was my point and desire in sharing all this information. You know, how do we know that this Georgia molding goes in this period of time, and how do I know that this molding was made in the last, you know, 20 years, right? What you have here is a change in how moldings are made. When I talked with Kukin Brothers and Windsor about designing their molding packages and designing their moldings, I really wanted an emphasis on historical accuracy. And if you look at historic moldings, you see all these sharp lines and sharp details, right? Because it would have been made by hand plane and would have been pushed over very carefully with sharp knives. Now, the reason this molding and moldings today end up being lifeless is because there is a laziness in my mind and a desire to make things cheap and fast. Now, what happens is that let's say a molding when it's first cut, and I'm just drawing a molding, okay? Let's just say that's our molding. I don't even know what it is. But what happens is that as the knife comes in here, right? This is our knife, this is our molder head right here, right? And this is our knife coming around and they cut this, right? But what happens is that this little spur right there, maybe this and this little knife as it comes down in here, right? Because this is our knife coming down into the molding, coming down into the wood. These end up burning, okay? And what I mean by that is the metal in the knife actually dulls and gets and loses its sharpness. And so what happens is the molder operator goes, you know what? I'm just going to round that because that way my knife will last longer, and I'm just not going to make this quite as deep. And all of a sudden, the next guy comes along and he does the same thing. Well, you know, I'm still burning that knife. It's not lasting quite as long. And all of a sudden, this molding starts getting flat. Now, you spend 30, 40 years chasing cheap, okay, chasing the quick, and you end up with a molding like this. That is made out of MDF, okay, because it's a cheaper material, and these moldings don't communicate and they don't mean anything, because now this molding, right, when I talked about the proportion before, it's so ugly I can't draw it. But you end up with this thing, and sometimes I've even heard guys say, well, the painters like it better because it holds paint better, okay? Well, all that means is that you can't read it, okay? All that means is that you put a little bit of paint on this, maybe 2 or 3 paint jobs, and this all of a sudden fills up with paint, and it's just a flat piece of wood. So the difference between good versus bad moldings ends up being a desire and a chase for quality, okay? And that each time period, right, has a story. So the Victorian period in here, and after World War II out here, right, all communicates a desire and a passion for, or a lack of passion for, how things should look. So just wrapping up, guys, picking good moldings really isn't a mystery, right? You're seeing that I'm looking through a classical lens, I'm looking through an historical lens, and really judging and looking at moldings of how they communicate, right? The narrative, the story that they're trying to tell. And I'm hopeful that after watching these videos, you can go to a lumber yard and start looking at these things and identifying, that's really an ugly molding. I put paint on that after a little bit of time and it just disappears. And so understanding how to communicate, understanding the flat surfaces, understanding that it's a language, hopefully will all help you to pick and choose better moldings in your local lumber yards. I want to thank my sponsors, Kukin Brothers, their classical American molding line, Windsor One with their moldings, both things I designed based on historic precedent. They're great people. They understand these questions. You can actually have good conversations with these guys. I'm Brent Hull. Thanks for watching.